Welcome to Upfront. We're here in the Shaw TV studios on Rob Ron Road in Campbell River. I'm Mary Ruth Harris. Joining us today, Jim Abram, a director for the Strathcona Regional District. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you very much, Mary Ruth.
Now, before we get into the issues, let's talk about you.
Oh boy.
Oh boy. So, where did you grow up?
Actually, I grew up in Los Angeles, California.
Did you really?
Born and raised there, went to university there, graduated, moved to Canada, became a Canadian citizen long time ago, 77. Renounced my American citizenship later. And
before it became the popular thing to do.
yeah, right. Also, I worked at numerous things, what used to be called Western Mines, Westmin. Worked at a shop in Campbell River for a number of years. I had my own shop for 5 years, making leather goods and selling art goods from other people. Arts and crafts at the old Beehive building, which was probably long before your time. And then decided to become a lighthouse keeper with my family, and we moved to Chatham Point Light Station and lived there 6 years, up north a couple of years, back down to Cape Mudge for 18 years, and pretty much the entire time from the time we hit Cape Mudge until I retired from light keeping, we were fighting the federal government to keep light stations staffed.
Yes.
And Campbell River was the hub of fight against destaffing with the federal government.
Okay.
And so anyway, we did that for a long time. And then about 1988, I was approached by my community of Quadra Island, which is where I live, to run in the local government election. And I did, and I won. And I have been the director for Quadra and the Outer Islands. It's called Discovery Islands, Mainland Inlets, since 1988 continuously.
Wow.
So it's been a long, strange trip.
Now, let's go back, back to Los Angeles for a minute. What did you study were you at UCLA?
No, I was at University of California, Los Angeles.
Okay.
And I started out in architecture, and I moved into painting and sculpture, just into an art degree, and that's what I came out with, a Bachelor of Fine Arts.
Cool. Painting
and sculpture. Actually, it says representation on my diploma. And here, 100 years later, I end up being nothing but representation, or representing my community. So it's been great. I've had probably 3 lifetimes in one so far.
Right.
And it's continuing, and I intend to continue it, and I intend to continue running in local government this next term.
So it's 30 years this year?
Yeah, roughly.
Wow.
30 years.
And you're going to run again, because there's elections coming up in October, right?
October 20th, I believe, something like that.
So they've moved it from November,
yes,
right?
It was November. It's always been November, and then they moved it to October starting this year. And they also last term changed it from 3-year terms to 4-year terms. So
right. I can't believe the 4 years are gone. It does not seem 4 years ago that we had municipal elections.
Yeah, it was a very quick term because of the fact that it has been so incredibly busy.
Yes.
We have dealt with anything and everything. It's been a real dog's breakfast, and never a dull moment, I'll tell you. The job itself, I call it a job, it's really a vocation, is pretty much 24/7, especially when you're an electoral area director, a rural director like I am.
Right. Because you're physically yourself, you're on Quadra Island, right?
I'm on Quadra, but I represent pretty much, I think it's 53% geographically of the regional district. So all of those islands and inlets up to the top of the mountains, all the way up to Port Neville, which is up by Sayward, and clear down to Middle Natch Island, are areas that I represent. So all those people Mostly concentrated on Quadra Island, Reed Island, some of the outer islands, and then a few small nodes up and down the coast. So, travel to those places is usually by boat or...
And time-consuming.
Time-consuming incredibly. I also represent the regional district on numerous outside appointments, and those appointments are to federal, provincial, and First Nations committees that operate up and down the coast, mainly to do with marine planning. Because we're a coast, everything's water dependent, and especially in my area. So I'm the lucky guy who gets to go to those meetings, and they're usually in Vancouver, Victoria, Haida Gwaii, Port Hardy, places like that. So travel around a lot.
So 30 years of serving your community. At what point in those 30 years, or has it, or did it, turn into a passion? Because you can't do something for 30 years after you've already had a career without it really striking a chord deep within. Do you remember that moment?
I think it was a passion when I started, because the federal fight that took place with the light stations, that was also a passion. I mean, I was doing it basically against the rules as a federal civil servant, and but there was no way that I was going to not put my all and my family's all into trying to keep staff on light stations, because they're so important to this coast. And when the opportunity came up to represent people in our communities, that same passion, just moved right over. I had no conflicts of interest, no land ownership or businesses or anything like that. I was basically just able to concentrate on the issues and follow them through to whatever level I could, whether it was federal government in Ottawa, provincial government in BC, or anything in between. There's a lot of bureaucracies out there to deal with.
Yes, there are. Now, let's move to maybe one of the happier stories since January. In January, you received quite a bit of money to go towards connectivity in rural areas and throughout the islands. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Okay, well, it's definitely a regional district success story as a region, and I started working on the connectivity issue back in the 90s, pretty much after I got elected, because we basically just didn't have anything on Quadra Island, and we needed it. People needed it, and as the world evolved, couldn't do business, couldn't do just social interaction, I couldn't do my business with the regional district, and without coming over to Camel River. So I started and pecked away at it with the major companies, and got a little bit here, a little bit there, banged my head against the wall for almost 20 years, basically, trying to get people connected. And it's a major issue with trying to keep the 20 to 40 somethings living on Quadra Island, because they want to work from home.
Yes.
They want to start businesses, they want to do that, and the older generation, 50 plus, are retiring early, retiring earlier, and moving to places like Quadra Island, and they want to continue their businesses.
Right.
And in order to do that, they need to be connected.
Right.
So,
not to mention staying in touch with families and grandchildren and
all of that,
great-grandchildren spread over the world.
Totally a given, that you have to do that. I mean, if you tell your kids you don't have a cell phone or you don't have connectivity of some sort, they divorce you. But except for the fact that there's going to be some inheritance someday. So it's very important, and it was, I think in the beginning it was more important to connect those businesses of the people that were retiring early, and trying to work at least a few days from home, a few days from Vancouver, wherever. And so, that was very important. And most of those people are far flung on Quadra. Very difficult, but we've managed so far. Not good enough.
So what will this chunk of money enable you and the local governments to achieve?
Well, a number of years ago, the regional district finally adopted a policy. Every year we do a strategic planning session where we sort of pick 5 major issues that we're going to work on that year. We're going to, really go for it. And we got connectivity in there as one of the top 5. So we did go for it. We hired a consultant to just sort of lay out the land for us to tell us where to go. And then programs started coming up, and we started hearing about programs. And so then we hired an even higher level consultant that was capable of working with the federal and the provincial government on those funding opportunities to try and get major money to do a major build coast-wide. We weren't just talking Strathcona Regional District. We're talking joining up all the way to Prince Rupert, all the way to Victoria, all the way down the Sunshine Coast.
Because wasn't this one of Justin Trudeau and the Liberals' promises in the last election that they were going to come up with funding in their budget for connectivity literally right across Canada in the rural properties?
I can't think of any Prime Minister that hasn't promised it. But yes, this was part of his platform. And the rural connectivity is, definitely high on the list. And that's what this money is about, rural connectivity. It's for the us people, the guys that are out there that, are in services that are in areas that just aren't served. I mean, you have, wonderful connections here on the Big Island and down to the cities and all those things. We don't have that. And we need it, so the regional district is now pursuing it. We just had a major announcement back in January by the federal minister, Jean Philpott, and the provincial minister, Jenny Sims, to tell us that we had been awarded, based on our application, about $45 million in order to connect communities. Now that's going to take in about 156 communities, and I think the number's around 44 of them are First Nations communities. Up and down the coast. So this is just, a dream come true. It really, really is. News. Because we're not only going to connect them, but we're going to connect them at a high level. Most of the connectivity, high speed at, let's say, approaching city level. Because, the highest we can get now through satellite internet or whatever is roughly 25 gigabits per second, which is not great.
I think we're up to about 150.
That's
remembering.
That's about what you are at.
So you've got a little ways to close that gap.
We definitely are working our way towards closing that gap, and this money will bring us a long ways towards closing that gap.
What's the time frame of getting those I'm imagining the infrastructure for that in place? Okay,
so we're pretty early in the stages of making all this happen. So lots of things can change, but I think the general consensus of the group that's working on this is that the build for the major infrastructure is going to be, the whole thing is going to be 1 to 3 years. So, we're talking ballpark here. I would assume that in this next year we'll get quite a bit done as far as the organizational part of it, the corporate body part of it, and the actual, laying of the cables part of it. That's got to start happening. And it's got to happen as quickly as possible because people are anxious. They really, really do want this to happen. They've been waiting a long time. I've been making a lot of promises based on what I'm being told, and some of them have come true and some of them have not, and I don't like that. I like to be able to deliver on what I tell people. So now with the regional district being, the lead in this, I think we're going to really move ahead. So.
Well, that's fabulous. Congratulations on the work that you did on that, and it sounds like a 1 to 3 year plan is realistic. And how great would it be if it happened in 2?
Oh, I mean, if, whatever happens, as it happens, people are going to be happy. And I think, congratulations to our regional district joining up with City West in Prince Rupert and in dealing with all of the other municipalities and local rural areas. This is just great, and we're going to be working with everybody,
Right.
coast from the northern coast to the southern coast, right to Vancouver.
Right.
So it's all going to be part of that.
That is amazing.
It's really a regional issue.
Now, speaking of connectivity, there is another way that we stay connected to all of the various islands, the big one included, and that's our ferry system. Now, I'm just going to recap as I understand it, and please jump in and correct me if I'm missing a piece. So way back in the 1960s, the BC ferries were actually under the Ministry of Transportation and Highways, correct?
Correct.
All right.
You get one point for that.
As part of the highway system, which makes total sense because that's how they are in the interior on the lakes, and they still remain there to this day. That should be noted. And then in 1978, right, under Bill Bennett's government, he moved the BC ferries out from under the ministry into a Crown corporation. That was where the original separation came. And then in 2003, it became another entity altogether, right? Am I doing all right so far?
You've done your homework.
Okay. So, and now the current premier has said that he is going to have a complete review of all the nuts and bolts. But for some reason, even though he alluded to the fact that it would include governance before the election, now that he's premier, the governance seems to have been left off the table, and they're just looking at the nuts and bolts, but not the governance, even though they are completely intertwined.
That's correct. You're absolutely correct. I should take you on tour with me.
So what, and I understand that there was a petition started just before Christmas, and Valentine's Day you presented it to the premier, over 15,000 names on it. Now that that's in his hands, what is the next step for the ferries coastal regional board? Is that, no, coastal, what's the correct name?
For the ferries?
For the ferry board that you sit on, like for the coastal
Okay, so I'm
board.
on the regional district chairs. I'm on the regional district ferry chairs group.
It's a very
weird name.
Very complicated name. So what's next for you guys in this fight? And it is a bit of a fight because I would think most people, common sense, would mean that if you're going to look from A to Z at at some entity, that would include everything from governance on down, because you can't look at the nuts and bolts without looking at what's running the nuts and bolts. So what are you guys going to do next?
Well, to back up, like, you got everything right as far as the governance structure, the timing, et cetera, and the election comments. I'm not going to call them promises because they were basically just discussions, and certainly governance was talked about as being, John Horgan at our Association of Vancouver Island Coastal Communities meeting talked very much about putting ferries back in the ministry. Okay, and so that's prior to the election, and then after the election, we were told everything is on the table. Those are his words. And of course, our MLA has said a number of times, everything from soup to nuts is going to be looked at in this study. Well, in my mind, that means, from dictionary definition, it's everything from the beginning to the end. And the beginning is the governance. There's no two ways about it. You can't deal with the details without taking a really hard look at the governance. And the governance is, the body right now is the BC Ferry Authority. That's the word that you were looking for. That's what was created, and we don't even know what it is. It's a weird,
it seems very,
spin-off from a Crown corporation.
Which is just like it's arm's length from the government, yet there's still some control by the government.
Yeah, and originally it was created in 2003 because the government wanted to offload $1.3 billion in debt that they had on their books.
Right.
In order to balance their budget, they needed to offload it onto something. So they created this authority, put it on their books. Okay, so now it's on their books
Okay.
to balance the budget.
Right.
Everything's great.
So they used, like 2003, that was right about the same time that they also made all of those awful changes in the education system.
Yes.
So that was where they were playing with the money, basically on all of those things. So that goes back to Gordon Campbell's Liberals when Christy Clark was education minister, and who was the ferry minister at that point? Do you remember?
Don't even remember, sorry.
That's all right.
Judith Wright, I believe.
Oh, yes, of course.
Okay.
So, there's one thing I remember, and I don't remember how many years ago, maybe 5 or 6, when one of the newspapers in Vancouver, right on the front page, they printed a comparison between the BC Ferries executive salaries and the Washington State executive salaries. And it was absolutely shocking.
Yes.
Shocking.
And it still is.
And it still is. And you didn't have to look any farther than that single page to know why there was so much debt with the ferries. As a citizen, it's so frustrating.
Well, and as a person that is a government representative and a citizen, it's very shocking to me. And when you look at the numbers, and these numbers are a bit skewed because what they did was they took all of the skippers from the vessels that were union staff, and they excluded them from the unions, put them into management.
Right.
Okay, so their addition, that was around 300 people, to the BC Ferry Board or Authority management added up to over 600 managers running BC Ferries. When they were in the ministry, we had 3 people working out of Little River down near Comox, out of an ATCO trailer, and those 3 people ran the entire minor routes ferry system. So that's all the small vessels, the Southern Gulf Islands, everything from the big ferries north to Haida Gwaii.
Yep.
Okay, they're all under these 3 people, and they ran perfectly. Now, that was still Ministry and Crown Corp.
Okay.
All right, so then you add 600 people to the management end, and they have a hard time figuring out what vessel goes where. It's just nothing has changed. There's still the same number of vessels, same number of terminals, pretty much the same number of employees, but yet everything is not running very well.
Right.
And it's costing us an incredible amount of money. Our ferry rates here from Campbell River to Quadra, we increased 128% since 2003.
Okay.
We are the only transportation system in the world that pays 100% of the operating costs of the ferries. The only other one that even competes with us is Transit in Lower Mainland, BC Transit, and they pay 47% of their operating costs, the rest is subsidy. We pay 128%. There's still subsidy that goes to the corporation, but it goes mainly for terminals, vessels, et cetera.
Right.
Okay, so you put it back in the ministry, you get rid of all those managers,
Right.
and you have a few civil servants at civil servant salaries,
Yes.
which are not up in the,
No,
plus,
in hundreds of thousands.
they're not in over 100 mostly. And those few people run the system.
Right.
I'd go down and do it for them if they'd let me. But the way it's sitting right now is that the Premier and the Minister and the government are looking at, in their comprehensive, remember, and comprehensive does not include governance.
Right.
So how can it be comprehensive? Anyway, they are looking at some of the details.
Okay.
Looking at the details is not the way to start as far as I'm concerned. So I'm totally in disagreement, and we've had our disagreements.
Right.
But
So-
that's fine.
Right, so moving forward, what is the game plan? Like, here we are in March. Moving forward, what is the game plan?
Okay, well, the game plan is, as far as I'm concerned, and as far as the ferry chairs are concerned, is we'd like it back in the ministry. We'd like it run properly, affordably, efficiently, and serving the communities that it's supposed to serve.
Right. And I
We
would
have
think
a
that you-
system, you mentioned the system in the interior. I mean, it runs perfectly.
It
And they
does.
have roads, you know.
Yes.
They have additional roads, but they can use the
Yeah,
ferry.
they have a choice, right?
Have a choice. We
Yeah.
have no choice.
Right.
We have communities like Powell River, all the Sunshine Coast. Some of them have to take 3 ferries to
Mm-hmm. Yes.
get to Vancouver. It's a full day's trip if they can get on a ferry,
Mm-hmm. Right.
because most times they're waiting.
Right.
And it costs them an arm and a leg, so
So
not fair.
now, are the chairs group going to be setting up a meeting in the spring with the government and sitting down with a representative or even the premier, like to have a heart-to-heart about?
Well, we just had a meeting recently. It was in December, I believe.
Okay.
And the plan is now to have further meetings
Okay.
with the minister, with the premier if we can get one, and try and convince them that the best way for the BC government to go is to put the ferry system back into the ministry
Yes.
and to run it accordingly. We
Now, are
all
they
pay for the.
concerned
Sorry.
that- Sorry to interrupt. Are they concerned that by moving it back into the ministry, it's going to have to bring the debt with it?
It will bring the debt with it.
Okay.
But right now, how much is the debt on what they're going to build for the Massey crossing? What's the debt on the amount of money that they dropped on the toll on the bridge? There's all kinds of things that have debt.
Right.
Debt is not a scary thing when you're talking about it over an entire provincial tax base,
Right.
which is why the ferries in the interior are free, because they're paid for by all of us. You and I are paying for those ferries. You and I are paying for the bridges, the roads, the
Yeah.
plowing, everything.
Right.
So we all need to be treated fairly,
Okay.
and the only way we can do that is to make it part of the transportation infrastructure. That's what it is. That's the way it should be considered. It's the marine portion of the highway.
Right.
There's no difference. It's water, it's not pavement, but it does the same thing. So
Correct.
let's fund it that way.
So our time together is coming to an end very quickly.
That's sad.
so-
isn't it?
I know. This has been a great conversation. I love that you guys have been awarded the $45 million for the connectivity project.
Right.
And we look forward to following the advancement of that. And I hope you'll come back sometime in the next year to bring us back up to speed on the connectivity of the wiring, but also the connectivity of the BC ferries, and keep us apprised of how the meetings go.
I'd love to come back anytime.
All
Just
right.
invite me.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Jim.
Thank you very much.
You've been watching Up Front on Shaw TV. Jim Abram, Director of the Strathcona Regional District, has been with us today as our guest. We will see you soon.